The imperial and US customary systems of measurement are two closely interrelated systems of measurement, both derived from earlier English system of measurement units which can be traced back to ancient Roman units of measurement, and Carolingian and Saxon units of measure. US customary units, developed and used in the United States after the American Revolution, are based on a subset of the English units used in the 13 colonies, while the imperial system of units was developed and used after 1824 in the United Kingdom and subsequently used in the rest of the Commonwealth. U.S. customary units are the predominant system of units in the United States, but in all Commonwealth countries the metric system has, to varying degrees, replaced the imperial system. Most of the units of measure have been adopted in one way or another since the Norman conquest. The units of linear measure have changed the least. The yard and the chain were measures derived in England. The foot used by craftsmen supplanted the foot used in agriculture, which was reduced in size by a factor of 10/11 to bring it into alignment. This resulted in there being 16.5 feet in a rod, pole or perch instead of 15 agricultural feet. The furlong and the acre, once it became a unit of the size of a piece of land rather than its value, remained relatively unchanged. In the last 1,000 years, 3 principal pound were used in England. The troy pound was used for precious metals, the apothecary's pound was used by pharmacists, and the avoirdupois pound was used for general purposes. The apothecaries and troy pounds are divided into 12 ounces, while the avoirdupois pound has 16 ounces. The unit of volume, the gallon, has different values in the United States and in the United Kingdom, the U.S. fluid gallon being about 0.83 imperial gallons and the U.S. dry gallon being about 0.97 imperial gallons. Both systems of measure were widely used in mechanical engineering, though not in electrical engineering. Some units of measure, such as the horsepower or the British thermal unit, have special names, but by and large unit names are generated from their constituent components, for example, pounds per square inch. In contrast, the metric system has a special name for pressure, the pascal. After the United States Declaration of Independence, the units of measurement in the United States developed into what is now known as customary units. The United Kingdom overhauled its system of measurement in 1824, when it introduced the imperial system of units. This resulted in both countries having different gallons. Later in the century, efforts were made to align the definition of the pound and the yard in both countries by using copies of the standards adopted by the British Parliament in 1855. However, these standards were of poor quality compared with those produced for the convention of the meter. In 1960, both countries agreed to common definitions of the yard and the pound based on definitions of the meter and the kilogram. This change, which amounted to a few parts per million, had little effect in the United Kingdom, but resulted in the United States having two slightly different systems of linear measure, the International System, and the Surveyors System. English units of measure. English units of measure were derived from a combination of Roman, Carolingian and Saxon units of measure. They were a precursor to both the imperial system of units and United States customary units, which evolved from English units from 1776 onwards. The earliest records of English units of measure relate to Saxon coinage. At that time coined were both weights and currency. The penny introduced by Offa was about 20 grains. Edward the Elder increased the weight of the English penny to 26 grains, thereby aligning it with the penny of Charlemagne. But by the time of the conquest, it has decreased to 24 grains. This value was subsequently called the penny weight and formed the basis of the troy units of weight, the troy ounce being used to this day for weighting precious metals. In 965 AD, King Edgar decreed that only one weight and one measure should pass throughout the king's dominion. In his report to Congress in 1817, John Quincy Adams wrote that the link between coinage and weight was broken during the reign of Edward I when he debased the English coinage by introducing a groat which weighed of 89 grains rather than the expected 96 grains. In the 1350s the groat was further devalued by reducing its weight to 72 grains. One of the enduring conflicts during medieval times was who had the right to define weights and measures. In 1197 Richard I decreed that the measures of corn and pulse, and of wine and ale should be the same throughout all England. The Magna Carta, signed by King John in 1215, extended this to include cloth. During Saxon times land was described in both terms of its economic value and in terms of an absolute size. In the Domesday Book, the hide, an economic unit of measure, was used, while there are references elsewhere relating to the furlong and to the rood that appear to be related to ploughing procedures. Of particular interest was the rood, which was 15 North German or Saxon feet in length, the North German foot being equivalent to 335 mm. Craftsmen, on the other hand, used a shorter Roman foot. Sometime between 1266 and 1303 the weights and measures of England were radically revised by a law known as the Composition of Yards and Perches, often known as the Composition for short. This law, attributed to either Henry III or his successor Edward I, instituted a new foot that was exactly 10/11ths the length of the old foot, with corresponding reductions in the size of the yard, ell, inch, and barleycorn. Furlongs and rods, however, remained the same, but the rod changed from 15 old feet to 161 halves new feet. Units of length were systematized by Edward II, who in 1324 defined the inch as being 3 barleycorns, the foot as 12 inches, the yard as 3 feet, the perch 5½ yards, and the acre as being an area 4 perches in width by 40 perches in length. Apart from the ell, which continued to be used in the cloth trade, and the chain, which was introduced by Edmund Gunter in 1620. These units formed the basis of the units of length of the English system of measurement. The units were, however, redefined many times. During Henry VIII's time, standard yards and ells made of brass were manufactured. During Elizabeth I's time these replaced these with standards made of bronze, and in 1742, after scientific comparisons showed a variation of up to 0.2% from the mean, a definitive standard yard was proposed. During the medieval era, agricultural products, apart from wool, were mostly sold by volume, with various bushels and gallons being introduced over the years for different commodities. In the early 14th century the wool trade traditionally used the avoirdupois system of weights, a process that was formalized by Edward III in 1340. At the same time, the stone, when used to weigh wool, was formalized as being 14 pounds. During the Tudor period, numerous reforms were made to English weights and measures. In 1496 Henry VII ordered that reference copies of the yard, pound and gallon should be made of brass and distributed to specified towns and cities throughout the kingdom. Many weights and measures that had crept into use were banned. In 1527 Henry VIII banned the Tower pound and the mercantile pound, and in 1592 Elizabeth I ordered the use of the statute mile. Under the Act of Union of 1707, Scotland, which had developed its own system of weights and measures independently of England, abandoned them in favour of English weights and measures. The Act of Union 1800, which united Ireland with Great Britain, had less of an effect on weights and measures, Irish weights and measures having been based on the English foot and pound avoirdupois since 1351. Though the Irish acre and mile were based on a perch of 7 yards, not 5½ yards as in England. By the early 19th century many commodities had their own set of units. The units of measure for the wool and cloth industries had units of measure specific to those commodities. albeit derived on the pound avoirdupois or the foot, while wine and beer used units with the same names but different sizes, the wine gallon being 231 cubic inches and the beer or ale gallon being 282 cubic inches. Agricultural produce was sold by the bushel, which was based on yet another gallon, the dry gallon of 268.8 cubic inches. Even though not explicitly permitted by statute, many markets use bushels based on weight rather than volume when selling wheat and barley. Imperial units. The British Weights and Measures Act of 1824 repealed all existing British weights and measures legislation, some dating back to the 1300s, and redefined existing units of measure. In particular, a new standard yard and troy pound were manufactured as the standards for length and weight respectively. A new measure, the imperial gallon, which replaced the many gallons in use, was defined as being the volume of 10 pounds of water at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, which, after the authorized experiments, was found to be 277.274 cubic inches. The bushel, which like the gallon, had definitions reflecting the various gallons, was defined as 8 imperial gallons. The 1824 Act also introduced some changes to the administration of the standards of weights and measures. Previously, Parliament had been given the custody of the standards, but the Act passed this responsibility on to the Exchequer. The Act also set up an inspectorate for weights and measures. The standard yard and pound were lost in 1834 when a fire partially destroyed the Palace of Westminster. Following a report published in 1841 by a commission, new standard yard and pound were manufactured using the best available secondary sources. Unlike the previous standard, the new pound standard was a pound avoirdupois. They were accepted by an Act of Parliament as the standards for length and weight in 1855, following the debacle over the different gallons that had been adopted by the United States and the United Kingdom 30 years earlier. One of the copies of the standard yard was offered to and accepted by the United States government. The 1835 Weights and Measures Act tidied up a number of shortcomings in the 1825 Act. In response to representations from traders, the stone and the hundredweight were formally defined as being 14 pounds and 112 pounds respectively, and the experiment of defining heaped measure as outlined in the 1824 Act was abandoned. Not all trades followed the use of the 14th stone. Britain, in 1880 for example, catalogued a number of different values of the stone in various British towns and cities ranging from £4 to £26. The 1835 Act also restricted the use of troy measure to precious metals and required that coal be sold by weight and not by volume. The Weights and Measures Act of 1878 overhauled the inspection regime of weights and measures used in trade. The Act also reaffirmed the use of the brass standard yard and platinum standard pound as the standards for use in the United Kingdom, reaffirmed the use of apothecaries' measures in the pharmaceutical industry, reaffirmed the 1824 definition of the gallon, removed the troy pound from the list of legal units of measure, added the fathom to the list of legal units and fixed the ratio of metric to imperial units at 1 metre being equal to 39.3708 inches and 1 kilogram being equal to 15,432.3487 grains. Subsequent to the passing of the Act, the volume of the gallon, which had been defined as being the volume of 10 pounds distilled water at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, was remeasured and set at 277.42 cubic inches. Though Customs and Excise continued to use the 1824 definition for excise purposes, the Weights and Measures Act of 1878 effectively prohibited the use of metric weights for trade. The United Kingdom having declined to sign the Convention of the Meet of 3 years previously, the standard imperial yard was not stable. In 1947 its rate of shrinkage was quantified and found to be 1 part per million every 23 years. In April 1884, H.J. Cheney, Warden of Standards in London, unofficially contacted the BIPM inquiring whether the BIPM would calibrate some meter standards that had been manufactured in the United Kingdom. Brock, director of the BIPM, replied that he was not authorized to perform any such calibrations for non-member states. On 17 September 1884, the British government signed the convention on behalf of the United Kingdom. The Weights and Measures Act of 1897 authorized the use of metric units for trade, a list of metric to imperial equivalents being published the following year. Under the Weights and Measures Act of 1824, custody of the standard yard and pound and custody of the administration of weights and measures was entrusted to the Exchequer, but verification was administered locally. The 1835 Act formally described the office and duties of inspectors of weights and measures and required every borough to appoint such officers, and the 1866 Act passed responsibility for weights and measures to the Board of Trade. In 1900, the Board of Trade established the National Physical Laboratory to provide laboratory facilities for weights and measures. After the passage of the 1897 Act, weights and measures in the United Kingdom remained relatively unchanged until after the Second World War. By the middle of the century, the difference of 2 parts per million between the British and US standard yards was causing problems. In 1900, a tolerance of 10 parts per million was adequate for science. But by 1950, this tolerance had shrunk to 0.25 parts per million. In 1960, representatives from the NPL and other national laboratories from the United States and Commonwealth agreed to redefine the yard as being exactly 0.9144 meters, an action that was ratified by the British government as part of the 1963 Weights and Measures Act. Metrication in the United Kingdom began in the mid-1960s. Initially, this metrication was voluntary, and by 1985 many traditional and imperial units of measure had been voluntarily removed from use in the retail trade. The Weights and Measures Act of 1985 formalized their removal for use in trade, though imperial units were retained for use on road signs, and the most common imperial weights such as the foot, inch, pound, ounce, gallon and pint continued to be used in the retail trade for the sale of loose goods or goods measured or weighed in front of the customer. Since the 1st of January 2000, it has been unlawful to use imperial units for weights and measures in retail trade in the United Kingdom except as supplementary units or for the sale of draft beer and cider by the pint or milk that is sold in returnable containers. The British Empire, when colonies attained dominion status, they also attained the right to control their own systems of weights and measures. Many adopted the imperial system of units with local variations. India and Hong Kong supplemented the imperial system of units with their own indigenous units of measure. Parts of Canada and South Africa included land survey units of measure from earlier colonial masters in their systems of measure, while many territories used only a subset of the units used in the United Kingdom. In particular, the stone, quarter and centile were not catalogued in, amongst others, Australian, Canadian and Indian legislation. Furthermore, the Canada aligned per ton with U.S. measures by cataloguing the ton of £2,000 as being legal for trade, but kept the imperial gallon. The standardization of the yard in 1960 required not only agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom, but also of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, all of whom had their own standards laboratories.